Joining us now to discuss the incoming tariffs is Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. Pete, thanks for joining us. I want to ask you, what immediate impact can Americans see if these 25% tariffs come in?
Well, there are several immediate impacts. One would be an increase in prices in certain goods because, after all, it is the American consumer, not the exporter, who ends up paying higher tariffs. The company that imports whatever good that's finished or whatever raw material it needs will simply pass along the price to Americans. There is nothing to be gained from high tariffs as far as American families are concerned. In fact, when a trade war was initiated with China in the hopes that they would be brought to the bargaining table, retaliatory tariffs ensued against our goods. American families paid the price, $1,700 per American family. That almost approaches the amount of tax relief that the 2017 tax law Donald Trump signed provided families. That's what's at stake here, the possibility of a renewed trade war, or the possibility of retaliatory tariffs, or the simple fact that American consumers will end up bearing the burden. Lots of consequences here.
I want to talk more about these retaliatory tariffs. Now, we do see that some 30 states receive energy from Canada, and then we've got Vermont, New York, Maine. They rely heavily on Canadian electricity. Could we see Canada, whether it be putting tariffs or perhaps even cutting off energy supplies to the U.S., as Ontario Premier Doug Ford has suggested?
That is quite possible. This is not necessarily the same situation we saw last week where the president told Colombia, look, if you're not going to take back some of your own people who were in the United States illegally, we're going to slap a tariff on you. And the Colombians briefly said, well, you're going to pay a higher price for coffee if you do. Colombia blinked. No, this is a different situation where there are major commodities beyond a mere cup of coffee that could be affected by a trade war. You mentioned energy. The report earlier mentioned automobiles. Think of minor and major appliances. Think of certain foodstuffs. This could be a very broad based problem if we find ourselves in the middle of a trade war. American consumers will pay the price of what's called tarifflation.
Right. And also here, I think a major concern is also the price of oil, right? Trump says that he possibly won't put a tariff on Canadian oil. And because lower energy prices was such a cornerstone of his election campaign, so cheap oil, of course, is important to him. Do you see other products that Mexico and Canada have that America needs and that might potentially get an exemption?
Oh, yes, absolutely. When you think of automobiles, for example, sure, some of them are made here in the United States. And I know Commerce Secretary nominee Lutnick was saying, well, we want more goods built here in the United States. Okay, fine, but there are certain components that are manufactured in Canada and Mexico that come into the United States and are then assembled here. What are we going to do about that? There are all kinds of produce items which would be brought into the United States from Mexico, which has a warmer climate. You're not necessarily going to be able to grow those things in the United States right away and replace them. Can we do without those goods? Well, you can do without almost anything but a glass of water and a bit of grain. But I don't think American consumers see it that way. There are goods that they depend on for part of their everyday lives that they're going to start either missing because they can't be brought here or are going to cost a whole lot more. In fact, the Tax Foundation calculated that $111 billion of net economic impact would be foisted on American families if the three types of tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada were to take effect on Saturday. That's the yearly impact. And when you think about that, that's about as much as the entire child tax credit program delivers to tens of millions of American families every year. That's the way we have to imagine this now. Imagine losing those valuable child tax credits, which are a couple of $1,000s for each child that you have.
Right, and Pete, I've got this question about the logic behind it all, right? Trump has accused Canada and Mexico of treating the U.S. unfairly in terms of trade. Now, I mean, it is true that the U.S. has this large trade deficit with both countries, but at the same time, the American consumer is much stronger than any Mexican or Canadian counterpart. So, would you not say perhaps it's natural that the U.S. would be importing more than it exports to these countries?
Yeah, it is natural. And a trade deficit is not necessarily a sign of weakness in the part of the United States. A budget deficit certainly is a sign of weakness. That's what we should be worrying about, as well as keeping taxes at a reasonable level. And look, the president doesn't have to surrender here. He certainly has plenty of leverage to obtain more concessions from Canada, Mexico, and China to get negotiations going right now. He doesn't have a full trade policy team. He could rely, however, on Treasury Secretary Bessent and his folks to start negotiating hard deals. That's what the president is good at, and that's what he should keep doing rather than imposing these tariffs very suddenly and very destructively. His policy he's advocated, zero tariffs, zero subsidies, zero trade barriers, is the right way to go. And you can get there if you're careful and not resorting to tariffs right off the bat.
Pete, last question for you here in the last 30 seconds. The last time Trump was in office, we saw sort of this back and forth of tariffs between Canada and the US for around a year before they both agreed to lift it. This time around, do you see any possibility of these tariffs ending before they start tomorrow or ending within a year or longer than a year? What do you expect?
I hope they will end before they begin tomorrow. If they don't, let's try to make this as short as possible. Again, with the United States using its leverage in a constructive manner, with Congress actually weighing in here and joining the president and engaging these two trading partners who are very, very important to our economy so we can figure out a way forward. We've done it before with the US Mexico Canada agreement. Let's start there. Let's figure out what isn't working, what is working, and let's move forward with negotiations.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens within the next 24 hours. Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union, thank you.
My pleasure.